Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We're here to talk national political news of the day. And for geeks like Dave and myself, was a big day this past Monday because the election has officially started with the Iowa caucuses. Iowa caucuses are a bit more complicated than a simple primary. You don't go there just to vote, but you go there to talk and argue and try to convince other people to switch their votes for your presidential candidate. It's very involved. Most states have abandoned the caucus system. The Democrats have moved Iowa, further along on the schedule. So all that was all that was dealt with was the Republican caucuses, and the Trump had his people fairly well organized despite very low temperatures. I believe Borowitz was reporting that the weather was going to dip down into single digits along with the average IQ of the caucus goers. He is a satirist, of course. But in the end, as expected, Trump won with 51% of the delegates. DeSantis came in a surprising second, and Nikki Haley came in a bit after him. Vivek Ramaswamy has now officially left the race, as has former Governor Chris Christie. So it is down to, I believe Asa Hutchinson is also out. I don't know if anybody even noticed that he pulled out. So it's really down to these three. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact of the Iowa caucuses. It's been argued that Iowa is less has less of an impact on the race than New Hampshire, since New Hampshire is or has been the first primary and will be the first primary, official primary for the Republicans coming up. But Trump obtained 51%. There's a lot of debate about whether or not this is really impressive on his part. That does mean 49% of the delegates voted against him. There was a poll over the weekend that says that nearly half of Nikki Haley's voters say they intend to vote for Biden if Trump is the nominee. But DeSantis has kept himself from losing. And Nikki Haley is, according to polling, favored to come in a strong second in New Hampshire, but we'll see what actually happens. A lot to talk about here in terms of the impact on this. Of course, so one of the criticisms and why the Democrats have moved Iowa and New Hampshire behind others, for among other reasons, including the fact that the Iowa Democratic Party really mishandled the caucuses last time around. But also that these two states are overwhelmingly white, and the Democrats have made South Carolina, which is has the Democratic Party majority is in fact black. This kind of gives a little bit of power to the Southern black vote anyway. But the Republicans are maintaining the same schedule, white people. And so I'm plenty to dissect here, Dave, but what do you have?
So there's a couple things here. Thank you, as always, for that setup. And I do think, like, we talk about the context here, like I think you alluded to, but Iowa's a very white state. So some folks don't take much credence in there. It's also a lot of folks identify as evangelical, like a very significant portion. And then finally, for folks that don't identify as evangelical, there's a very high percentage of people culturally who identify, who self-identify culturally as conservative there. So it was ripe for the environment is ripe for Trump to do well. And he did. By winning by over 30 points, or approximately 30 points over Ron DeSantis, and then marginally more than that, another 2 points over Nikki Haley. So there was some talk about how Nikki Haley had a chance of maybe having a big splash, maybe denting Trump's margin, maybe coming in second. That didn't really happen. So a lot of the sort of national buzz about the Iowa caucus kind of was a dud to a certain extent. Also, because it was so cold, the turnout was very low.
Right.
In the past, it was about 160,000 people, and this was about 110,000 people. I think it was the lowest in 20 years, I heard.
And just real quickly, of course, the Democrats are trying to argue that the low turnout was because lack of interest in the Republicans. Probably not the case, but they
Yeah.
are making that argument.
It was like dangerously cold and dangerous driving conditions, and that you can't discount that too much. Another thing that came up too in media conversation was the fact that the AP called the race very early. So AP has a rule that says that they won't call a race until the polls close, but that really applies to primaries much more than it does to a caucus. Really, as soon as the doors were closed and nobody else was allowed in, the AP used entrance polls
Hmm.
to approximate calling the race, because they said, look, it's probably about a huge enough margin that they can just call it. Which Ron DeSantis, he took that opportunity to complain vociferously about how the media is in the tank for to create the narrative that the media wants to create, which um, I think my personal take on that is that while in principle they should have let some of the caucuses play out, because in a caucus environment, there's, for folks that don't know, you all go in one room and you go to the part of the room where you support the candidates' representatives, and there's jockeying that happens. And traditionally, I think that's why people actually like the caucus from a citizenry / voter perspective, because there is sort of that conversation. There's that face to face politicking that happens. But anyway, that didn't really play out quite like it usually does, because the race was called so early. Now, that said, 30 points is 30 points. So maybe it was just a marginal difference in a final outcome. But what that means is that the delegates that were assigned, Donald Trump's 51% correlates to 20 delegates, and DeSantis's 21% correlates to 9. Nikki Haley's 19 correlates to 8. I think Vivek got like 3 delegates. Yeah. So the those numbers might have been slightly different, but again, this is a moment where people could say that there's some narrative out there. I think that's a little bit sour grapes on DeSantis's part, but at the same time, they probably should have let this process play out, because it might be anachronistic, but I think it's interesting. One last thing here is that now the question is what happens next. And so New Hampshire is next, but Ron DeSantis knows he's got no traction there, and in fact, he's going to look bad no matter what happens. So he announced right afterwards that he's actually going to travel straight to South Carolina and start fighting there, which is Nikki Haley's home state. So he's got an uphill battle there too.
Yeah, she was governor. Now, if she does not come in at least a strong second in South Carolina, her campaign is over. That's because that's her home state where she was governor, and if she can't pull that off, that's pretty much it. I mean, honestly, it really doesn't look like anybody's going to catch up to Trump anyway. The polls all have them ahead. Maybe New Hampshire will be kind of close because Nikki Haley has been presenting well there, and New Hampshire Republicans, like a lot of other New England Republicans, aren't quite MAGA as other southern or midwestern populations. But and it's real important to know that caucuses are often benefited by, I don't want to say the most militant of votes, but campaigns that are really organized at the grassroots level, because you got to get people there. Again, you're not going to cast a vote; you're going there to argue, to cast votes, and the way some caucuses are done is you'll have vote after vote after vote until somebody has more than 50% of the delegates in the room. Not all caucuses work that way, but in Iowa, I know that there are repetitive votes all the time, and it can take all night. So you're giving up a whole night. You're not just waiting in line and clicking something. So it does tend to favor people with grassroots support, with that type of organization, getting your people out. Democrats traditionally benefited. The candidates that were pro-labor benefited because labor gets their people out, right? Jesse Jackson would defeat the caucus in a lot of the caucuses because his was a very motivated base campaign. Same thing with Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton. So it does tend to favor what we refer to as movement candidates. Well, this time it kind of did. And it's kind of interesting, though, because they are also saying that the more fanatical the voter, the more likely they are to take to show up in really rough weather that way. And so it has raised the question as to whether or not this win for Trump was really all that impressive. And that's well, nobody's going to say that, well, he didn't win, right? I mean, he won. He got the most delegates, 30% closest to the next one, but he got 51%, which means 49% did not vote with him. We'll see what happens in the first primary. But if this is a time for, if DeSantis and or Nikki Haley are going to make a move, it needs to happen now, like by South Carolina, because after that it'll be too late.
Yeah, a couple things here too. There's talk that with Christie having dropped out since our last conversation, and Vivek having dropped out, that it sort of is consolidating, sharpening the pencil here for folks in some of these states, and that what we see is that for the people that like Nikki Haley and like that sort of traditional conservative establishment approach that she brings, that at least now there's a little bit less options, and so she will see a bump, but she's already behind by about 15%, depending on the poll. I think it's inching slightly closer than that, maybe in some of the averages that you look at, whether it's 538 or Real Clear Politics, which is averaging like all the polling, but it's trending towards the gap narrowing. But I think Trump does have a superpower to a certain extent, and he's really able to pick the sort of the right thing to say at the right time. Maybe not in his speeches, and maybe not in courtroom,
Sure.
but when he's being critical of his opponents in a competition of this nature, he does seem to be saying the right thing to motivate his base and sort of put down the challenge and the competition. But that said, there have been leaks, there have been rumors that Trump's people are saying, hey, you need to sort of target Nikki Haley, target her, and he has said, hey, what about her as a vice presidential candidate? And his staff is saying, no, you don't want that, but he appears to want it for some reason, and maybe that's because it sort of first of all, people are speculating that it's a woman that he chooses as a running mate, but also just because some of the other people that you and I think we disagree on this. I mentioned it once before that even though it sounds counterintuitive, Trump is really he's increasing his approval pretty significantly amongst all groups. So I don't think he feels like he's threatened or in jeopardy. But his one big weakness, if there is one, it's higher income earners, and areas with higher educated folks, and that's where Nikki Haley does really well.
Yeah. That's no, that is the case. I mean, there's a lot to discuss here. How do DeSantis and Haley have a chance? DeSantis is trying to position himself as, I'm Trump, but without the baggage. The problem is he's got his own baggage, and Haley, who was kind of started out as a never Trump, but she wants to walk the line. She wants to try to get some of the MAGA votes, but also get the never Trump vote, and that's a hard thing to do when she's not, when she's not really attacking. It's going to be hard for her to even get excited, get never Trumpers excited if she's not really attacking Trump on fundamental issues such as the existential threat to democracy and the rest. And she's back and forth. Her whole thing is, well, we don't want chaos. That is the appeal. I would find it difficult to believe that Trump really wants Haley as a VP because she's disloyal. She has not shown the kind of loyalty. I actually think she's probably, if he wants a woman, he'll probably grab somebody like Huckabee or the woman up in North Dakota,
Kristi Noem.
Yeah. So, but who knows? I would love to see a debate between Harris and Nikki Haley. I mean, those are two very intelligent women, very savvy about a lot of different things, and really good at debate. But I don't see that happening. Of course, Ramaswamy immediately endorsed Trump once he dropped out. That was everybody expected that. I don't know if Christie has actually endorsed Haley. He did defend Haley in an earlier debate, but I don't know that he's actually made an endorsement at this time.
I'll just add that this happened after our last show that we did, but Christie, before the last debate, was caught on a hot mic, and he was throwing bombs, really sort of behind the scenes, verbally speaking, and he did say that she's going to get smoked, and he kind of put her down a little bit. Just maybe it's sour grapes, maybe it's just like, hey, that's what you do when you're about to step down and tap yourself out of the race. But I think that in his sort of farewell speech, he sounded like he was saying, look, you guys had an opportunity to really target Trump this whole time, and you've not been doing that. And so indicating no support.
Well, next up is New Hampshire, and we'll be discussing that.
So we anticipate with SB 4 that cracks down on illegal entry, that should reduce the number of people coming across the border. We've already seen, if you talk to Mike Banks or talk to General Seltzer, one thing they can tell you is that because of the actions that we've already taken, Texas, which used to be number one for illegal crossings, now has been displaced by Arizona, which is number one for illegal crossings. But my point is that actions and deterrence work in causing the migrants to go elsewhere. With SB 4, the consequences of it are so extreme that the people being smuggled by the cartels, they will not want to be coming into the state of Texas. The cartels will not want to be coming into the state of Texas. And so we expect a dramatic drop.
All right, we move to the state of Texas. I think Texas comes up in our shows more than any other state, maybe besides Florida and occasionally California. But Texas is in the headlines again because Governor Abbott, in addition to busing immigrants to New York City and all of the game playing in that area, has seized a major park along the border and is refusing to allow federal agents in. The federal agents have claimed that they were going in there to deal with emergencies, and they were prevented from doing so. So far, the Department of Justice is not saying that they're going to go to court over this, but it really is hard to see. It's one thing for them to seize the park, but to not allow federal agents to go and do their jobs, I find it hard to believe that even the SCOTUS majority would agree with that. But I think that's what Abbott wants. He wants the notoriety of it and the government to tell him not to do it. The courts, even with the conservative majorities, and maybe especially with them, have been very firm that immigration is in the federal province by virtue of the Constitution. Immigration is what is supposed to be left with that. When we had in California, when we were still kind of in more or less a purple state in the 90s, passed, I believe it was Proposition 187, in which the California was going to decline benefits to undocumented immigrants, and that got shut down by the federal government. And that was the Supreme Court, I believe, refused to hear it, which is basically to endorse it, and from the appellate court level. So I have no doubt that the federal courts would slap Abbott down and say you got to do this. But I think Abbott is enjoying the hype that he can create around the stand that he's taking.
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating situation, and it is unfolding rapidly. Just before we recorded this, I did take a peek to see if there was any movement, and in fact, there was. It seems like just a little bit ago, the Biden White House, in addition to what we've seen, is that they've said that they've already reached out to the Supreme Court to intervene. Because Texas has sued the Border Patrol agents' practice of removing razor wire, and the appeals court said there's no, Federal Border Patrol has no access by law. Let's hold out until the courts get to hear it. So in addition to that, rather than kind of sit still, Department of Homeland Security said that by the end of the day today, if Texas doesn't cease and desist that practice, they will refer it to the Department of Justice for, quote, appropriate action and consider all other options available to restore Border Patrol's access to the border. If Texas doesn't confirm that it will cease and desist around Shelby Park area. So they're not sitting still. The administration's not sitting still. I think one of the catalysts for this issue, and again, we're talking about a 2.5 mile section of the border. And so the park is called Shelby Park, where I guess they had set up a temporary kind of staging area. But the Texas, what's the name of the organization? Texas Military Department and other, sheriff's agents from Texas that were kind of deputized by the governor, I guess, or signed by the governor rather, for this part, for their role here. What started this, I think, the sort of escalation here beyond just the practice itself was that Border Patrol was advised by Mexican authorities that there was a group of people attempting to cross and they were in distress and they were denied. The Border Patrol was denied access. Mexico said, hey, we found 2 people that had drowned. We rescued a few others. And I think there was a total of like 3 people who were saved. 2 deceased, 2 nearly drowned, something like that. And anyway, so this gave pretext for the federal government to step in and say, look, not only is this a hypothetical anymore, now people are dying because you're not letting us do our constitutional play our constitutional role.
Yeah, although one clarification there, the Department of Justice later clarified in a filing to the court that the drownings had already occurred when the Border Patrol agents were trying to get access. But the point is, they wanted to get there because they were worried that other immigrants were going to face the same fate. Migrants were going to face the same issues. And, Abbott over the past week has said something like, no, we're not shooting people because the federal government would charge us with murder if we did, as if this was a bad thing. I mean, it's really gotten, arrogant about that. But, it is very problematic what Texas is doing.
And I'll say too, there's a couple sort of points, follow-up points, I guess, basically. One is that there's been an escalation on the citizen side to support Governor Abbott, excuse me. One of these patriot groups, and I don't recall the exact name of the patriot group, but they've said, hey, look, everybody, let's go support the governor. And there's a quote, demand that elected officials honor their oath of office to defend the border against a foreign invasion. Right. So they're buying into a little bit, not buying into, they believe the sort of dogma or rhetoric that this is really an invasion and a dereliction of duty. And so that comports with Governor Abbott's position. Also, candidate former President Donald Trump, his position. And finally, just to kind of buttress this and show that it's not just activist citizens and sort of a rogue sheriff's department, it's really coming from the top. The Attorney General of Texas has said Texas will not surrender.
Yeah,
And he's saying, hey, look, we'll fight this in court. We have the constitutional authority to defend our territory, and we plan to do so. Now, obviously, you and I say obviously, from our past conversations, I think we both agree this is a federal role, and that the state, yes, the state of course has a role to play, but it's not to keep the federal government from doing their job.
Yeah, I mean, we also need to point out that Eagle Pass, where the park is located, said, or where a park is located, said they did not approve the state takeover of a city park. They appealed to the federal because they obviously have, they can't override the governor on that. But this is anyway, and Paxton is writing threatening letters, but. I think they're hoping that SCOTUS is just going to change all of the precedent, because states routinely lose these fights on immigration. And so, I do think that Abbott is thinking about a run for president eventually. But the problem is, if he ever steps outside of Texas, he's going to have problems with this legacy. But for now, he's really popular, or at least fairly popular in his own state. Hard to say. Popular in the communities that you have suggested, but he spends a lot of money on this, a lot of state money on this, and there is some pushback on him for that. Apparently, I heard before the show that when he sends the immigrants to New York on buses, which should cost $300, he spends $1,600 per person on that, which is that's government at work, right? I mean, that's just why pay the price when you can pay 5 times as much. So anyway, this is probably good politics for Abbott. He's probably getting a lot of kudos from a lot of people in Texas. But again, we've been talking about how this has been a state that's become more and more purple. The problem I see with that is it may not be as particularly women are starting to leave the state because of the abortion policy, which we've discussed. And I think finally a woman died from not being able to get treatment. I don't know if that happened in Texas, but in one of those states. And so you've got these two policies that differ. And unfortunately, attacking immigrants is kind of popular at the moment. At least it's not wholly unpopular, because Democrats and progressives have really not been successful on the narrative of this. This is what allows Abbott to get away with this stuff politically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, this culture war aspect of this, where, you and I have kind of done a deep dive on the border crisis and sort of what really is happening when it comes to drug smuggling, and kind of what are real think tank and academic potential solutions to policy, and sort of from a congressional legislative perspective, what kind of compromise could be reached in a way that could sort of satisfy both sides. But rather than go to deep dive details, I think just keep it at the political level. The reality is that it's really helpful for team building and kind of drumming up support for the upcoming elections for people, like Governor DeSantis from Florida. He's actually staked the gist of his presidential run is around him being as far to the right on culture war issues as he can. So much so that Donald Trump has actually said, "Hey, you've gone too far on the 6-week abortion ban," and Texas isn't that far behind. Governor Abbott is not that far removed from the sort of extreme positions that Governor DeSantis has taken. So it's part and parcel to building the agitating the base, getting, building the potential turnout for the upcoming election. And in particular, in the Congress right now, as some of the Republicans are either, kicked out or resign or are sick or are stuck in bad weather. As we speak, I think they're down to only 218 Republican members around Washington, D.C. right now. And there's a chance that if it drops one more person, that they can't even pass anything on their own, and that anything they pass would have to get get Democratic support. So granted, that's not going to last forever, but it shows that they have to keep everybody in line, and that includes the farthest, the Freedom Caucus, etc.
Well, Dave, maybe you want to comment, because I don't know if you saw the latest news, but the spending deal appears to be at least not happening because the right wing pressured Johnson again on the border issue. They want
you read my mind.
Yeah, draconian measures on that. So this is their politics. This is the issue that they're hoping will be what abortion has been for Democrats. It's hard to say whether it'll go that far, but if more people are dying on the border, I think it's going to backfire on them. But we will see on that. But right now, it doesn't look like there's going to be a spending bill, and government may be shut down, which moderate Republicans don't want. So it'll be very interesting, but Johnson may not allow it to the floor, even though it will inevitably pass if it gets there. So this is, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah.
As to how it applies to border politics.
Exactly right. Yeah. So this is one of those things where what you're hearing, or what we all are hearing from the folks who are trying to make a stand on border, saying, look, this has to be funded. Some of the rhetoric says, and we have to see tangible results, which the government was set to shut down in 2 days from now, as we speak, and that deal, I think, will be from what my spidey sense, I guess, is that they won't shut down on Friday. They'll figure out a way to continue this conversation up through the next couple of weeks, which is when the real firm deadline really hits. But I think Speaker Johnson doesn't have an interest in seeing a shutdown. In fact, quite the opposite. So it's really contentious, and somewhere in the middle, somewhere between, we need a policy that sort of temporarily locks things down, adequately funds judges to process people, temporarily redefines asylum, temporarily suspends the paroling of people who are captured, rounded up crossing the border illegally. They can't all happen. They can't all be part of this budget compromise. Yeah. So the question is, how much of these solutions could make it into the final agreement sufficiently that the moderates in the Republican Party can stick together, and they're not going to be fully satisfied, but neither will the Democrats who go with it to avoid the shutdown.
But it has to get to the floor before the moderates can even vote on it. So and that's in Johnson. That's up to Johnson. The goofy way it's been set up. The Constitution didn't set it up that way. It's just the way the rules of the House is, that the majority leader in both houses can control what goes to the floor. But Biden is also trying to make use of the fact that his discussions with Obrador in Mexico have led to Mexico cracking down, grabbing Venezuelans, taking them to the southern, back to the southern border, sometimes even flying them into Venezuela. And it's reduced the numbers drastically over the past few weeks. It's probably temporary. Obrador probably isn't going to keep doing this, but they're literally grabbing people off of buses and trains en route to the border. People who actually had made arrangements to meet with officials for asylum, and now being sent back to Venezuela, which in the old days of the Cold War, that never would have happened. I mean, there's the Republicans' take on Venezuela is that it's basically communist, right? Any Cuban that made it here was given asylum, but they seem to that those politics don't seem to be reflected lately because they don't know how Venezuelans are going to vote for whatever reason. Cubans have always voted kind of conservative. Vietnamese did, at least for a generation after they came, fleeing communist, because the Republican Party was considered that. But it gets really convoluted. But Biden is trying to use the fact that the people that have been stopped at the border have drastically reduced, but everybody knows it's temporary.
I guess what I'm saying is your brief, and this is very explicit in your brief, is like it just doesn't matter if our institutions look like America. And I guess what I'm asking you is, doesn't it? I mean, doesn't it? These are the pipelines to leadership in our society. It might be military leadership. It might be business leadership. It might be leadership in the law. It might be leadership in all kinds of different areas. Now, if universities are not racially diverse and your rule suggests that it doesn't matter, well, then all of those institutions are not going to be racially diverse either. And I thought that part of what it meant to be an American and to believe in American pluralism is that actually our institutions are reflective of who we are as a people in all our variety.
Last topic, affirmative action. This has been sort of a mainstay of the civil rights movement and much of what we call the left for decades. As we've discussed on this show, the Supreme Court has basically held that any university, even private universities receiving federal funds, cannot have a race-based affirmative action program, cannot basically exclude people or prefer people on the basis of race. And a Gallup poll taken recently actually says that 68% of Americans viewed the decision favorably, while 32% said it's mostly a bad thing. And it's really important to note that the support for the decision is weakest or least strong with Black Americans, but even the majority of them, 52%, are in favor of abolishing affirmative action in the universities and elsewhere. It's been a very difficult policy to defend on the basis of the fact that the majority of Americans try to see things in a way that the left doesn't. They want to see color blindness or colorblind policies. That was what Martin Luther King pushed back in the 60s, which actually caused a backlash against him within the Black activist movement, particularly people like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture. But a slight majority of polled white adults believe that the ruling will have no difference on campus diversity, while 7% of Asian adults, 49% of Black adults, and 36% of Hispanic adults believe the impact will be slightly less diverse on college campuses. So even people who acknowledge this is going to make an impact on diversity are saying we need to be rid of this policy. Now, there are a lot of other types of affirmative action that can be taken. A lot of the studies are indicating that when you go class-based, it's not having the same impact. It's not being real effective at diversifying. But I actually have looked at it, and I think it's because the implementation of that different kind of affirmative action has been really, I think, inadequate. And affirmative action can mean different things. There are different types of affirmative action. They don't all mean quotas or preferences. It could be the communities that you target for advertising, your university and the rest. And then and if you really make an effort on the income level, since there is a correspondence of more working class people who are in these groups, those policies could work. And I'm thinking that's probably the way it's going to happen, because it's legally has been struck down, and so until there's another Supreme Court majority that's different from this one, it's not going to come back at all. And And so maybe but rather than simply saying, oh no, class-based doesn't work, maybe look at the implementation, because it's also now becoming politically unviable. I mean, if you can't get the majority of black voters to support affirmative action, then maybe the left needs to, say, well, we lost that one. It's just a suggestion.
So this is really interesting times, I think, because the prior case that was the ruling case, Grutter versus Bollinger, that held for since 2003, and it was just this past summer that the status quo changed. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. This was a 6-3 decision on policy on party lines. I think the big takeaway, just to get an understanding of how the court, what their position is ultimately on ending affirmative action in education, was that the policies, here's a quote from Chief Justice Roberts, lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, the dissenting voices, they don't agree with that. They said that's factually not correct. But the truth is that that's the prevailing law on the land now. And I think you hit the nail on the head, that this new poll from the Gallup Center on Black Voices, that was the name of the convening division within Gallup, which is a highly reputable polling organization. The big takeaway, 78% of American adults say that the ruling in that case was 68% think that mostly a good thing. So that's a huge swing. As recently as like 8 years ago, it was the other way around, where you were seeing nearly 70% saying that supporting affirmative action goals. So not to just kind of mix the message here, but the culture war has been highly effective at setting the tone, what we listen to, what we hear, what we think about. And like you said, if nearly in a country where nearly 70% of Latinos and over 60% of Asians and over 50% of Black Americans, if all of these people are saying, hey, we don't want race anymore, that to be this sort of determinative principle in allocating a cross section of diversity in an advanced education setting, that's a massive cultural shift, and that doesn't bode well for the broader efforts outside of higher education. That's what I was thinking, higher education. So higher education itself is a really, it's a discrete set of considerations here. But I think the number was about 50% of the Black respondents even said, yes, this will have a negative impact on higher education. But it was much lower for everybody else. And also people were saying, in fact, it is affecting where I will apply to, knowing that I will now have what amounts to a fair, sort of equal ground. People are saying it will affect where I apply to. I think I'll have a better chance here or there. And it's really just a slight majority of Black people are the only people left in this, from a perspective of kind of continuing to support and endorse the idea that this should even be a valid goal.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an issue for a long time, but I think that the plaintiffs in the Harvard case were very clever. They did not have white clients. It was Asians who did it, and Asians overwhelmingly favor what are called merit-based admissions. The problem that they're going to run into is, it's not all merit-based, and in particularly in private schools, it's your legacy. Your dad went there, and your grandfather, and if that's factored in, that's going to have a negative impact just by itself on people who are not in the criteria of rich white folk who traditionally attended these universities. So we've talked about this before. The politics have made it all the way to San Francisco, where actually it was involved in a recall of a couple of board members, in which one of the issues is that Lowell, which is an incredibly renowned college prep school, basically private school, and you have to get into it. And among one of the main criteria is your testing. And Asians have done quite well against all of the other groups, and they've actually tried to have like a kind of affirmative action in there, because it's been said that the school would be entirely Asian and Russian. Apparently, the Russian students also do very well, and so what happened was they tried to go to a different type of admittance system, and the head of the board and a couple of others, the head was African American, got caught referencing Asians as, a wannabe white group and the rest. And this led to a huge blow up that had national impact. Now, of course, this is not this is not an indication of a right-wing turn. It may be that the concept just isn't as popular anymore. But there are, again, like I've been trying to say, I think that there are other ways that you can diversify it, and the fact that they haven't worked right early on means that you got to fine tune them. You got to look at what you're doing and not just say, oh, the only thing that works is preference. And so but that's where it's going to have to be, because as far as I can see, this is, outside of the academic left and the activist left, people want what they consider to be merit-based, even if the concept of merit is kind of elusive and more subjective than they let on.
I think this is obviously a topic for another day when we'll talk about diversity, equity, inclusion on a more sort of granular level. But I think part of I would like to speak in our final minutes here a little bit to the court piece of this, and looking forward. Again, you and I will talk more about this in the future. But there is this doctrine called the Chevron doctrine.
Right.
That's being adjudicated right now and today, and in fact, in two cases in the Supreme Court, where there's a 40-year-old precedent that basically holds that if a law is written ambiguously, the federal agency crafts the regulation, and based on their reasonable reading of the statute, and then judges have an obligation.
Judges were to defer.
Judges had to be deferential. But when we talk about civil rights, and we talk about how are civil rights really, where do we see progress, where do we see challenges, where do we see growth, often it happens in the courts. When you say, hey, look, this is the law, this was our goal, but the courts are going to say, you know what, it wasn't really met. But on the ground, the implementation piece is often federal agencies. And by overturning this doctrine, by trying to overturn this doctrine, what conservatives are saying is, hey, like let's put the burden on the legislature to have more foresight, to be more thoughtful, to be more robust, to be more comprehensive.
To micromanage.
And we know, like, there's a reason that Congress has the lowest institutional approval rating across almost every maybe even all institutions. They may very well be the lowest. Last I looked, it was like 19% think they're doing a good or a very good job. So it's because of the sort of intractability, the inner conflict that Congress seems to have, where it's like a bipolar sort of thing. It's with us or against us. There's a lack of compromise. People say civility. I don't think civility. I think deliberation is what's missing. It's the capacity to say, these are the things, these are our aspirations, these are our compromises. Let's put forward the best legislation that we can together. That is not the environment that our legislature finds itself in. So if this rule, the Chevron doctrine, disappears, all of the existing federal regulations are in jeopardy in effect. And again, that's another conversation for another day. But we have a really hard time in this country communicating effectively with each other about issues of the merits and the value of the diversity of inputs into any enterprise, whether it's a company, or academic. These things, it's clear so many immigrants coming into our country are actually high achievers in the economic sphere, starting companies, coming up with patents, innovations, high academic achievement. That's the breadth of ideas that we could all be collaborating on. If you say to you, if it was the case that the courts had to be the ones saying, oh, hey, look, if the legislature didn't put it in writing, it's not going to happen, then we run the risk of an awful lot of our legislation, regulation, this mismatch of meeting the goals they set out to achieve.
Yeah, I want to really quickly also point out that, the reason I've supported affirmative action preferences is that I think it doesn't just address the historical racism. That's the argument that's always meant, is that it's trying to redress historical inequities by bringing it to now, but it also addresses what I refer to as implicit bias, or inherent subconscious racism.
Eeny, meeny, chili, beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This brings us to predictions. What do you have, Dave?
Today, I'm going to talk about the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. campaign, the thing that very few people really want to talk about, but I think to a certain extent it's the elephant in the room. When you look at the polling comparing Biden to Trump for president, you see often at a national level it's really close. It's within a point or two, generically, and it varies by state, of course. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is getting approximately 10% approval support across key battleground states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Florida. These are going to be determinative. And if he weren't in the race, experts show or predict that it would impact evenly both Trump and Biden, fairly evenly anyway. So with that in mind, there's a couple new pieces of information that came out this week. New York Times reported that he is registering a new party called We the People in 6 states, plus the Texas Independent Party, which would end up lowering the amount of signatures he needs to get on the ballot by a third if he tried to get on all 50 states. So this is actually really, it's lowering the barrier for him to get on more ballots. So far, he's only on 1 ballot in Utah. Secondarily, and this is more important, he is rumored to be making a vice presidential announcement that coincides with his scheduled trip to Hawaii. So I'm going to, I'm not the first one that thought of this, but I do think it's going to happen. I think he's going to make Tulsi Gabbard his running mate. And I think when he announces that, she will have just signed a deal with X, formerly known as Twitter, for a huge role in terms of media that would place them in a position to really, address the headwinds facing both Trump and Biden in terms of their negatives. And so my prediction is that he will end up being a wild card that impacts overall turnout, especially of undecided and discouraged voters, and may in fact end up being a spoiler.
All right. Well, we don't even know who it's going to spoil. Well, I'm going to predict next Tuesday night, New Hampshire primary. I predict that Trump gets about 45%. Haley comes close and gets 40%, and DeSantis is way back with about 15%. I don't think that Trump is going to get more than the plurality, but I do think he will come in first because I think Haley floundered a bit in Iowa. And with that, we'll be back to discuss it the day after the results and their meaning. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.